Remember Boston? Not like the city, that would be a crazy thing to ask. You know Boston, the band. You're either familiar with them because you grew up in the 1970s, you had parents who did, or because you jammed out to their song Foreplay/Long Time in the original Rockman game. It was that one, wasn't it? It was a band defined by big hits, spacey record sleeves, and stadium-sized compositions, and judging by the enormity of their sound, it would be easy to assume that these Massachusetts musical mavens are the result of some studio session supergroup. But what if I were to tell you that Boston was just a dude, and that he was less of a rock star and more of a mechanical mad scientist who built one of the first home recording studios in history with his bare hands so he could make music like nobody had ever done it before? And also that he's the reason why that one McGee song is called Rockman? Let's explore the life, lawsuits, technical wizardry, and personal destruction of the MIT engineer turned one-man hitmaker and Boston founder, Tom Scholz. Although Boston got its namesake from the northeastern metropolis where the band was formed, the act's most important figure came up in the Midwest. Born in Toledo, Ohio in March of 1947, Tom Scholz was the very definition of the baby boomer generation. As the son of a wealthy carpenter and home designer, Scholz experienced a childhood defined by education and imagination. Scholz was a varsity basketball player and studious scholar. Outside the classroom, Scholz also discovered a penchant for mechanical experiments and tech design. Idling away the summer days over custom go-karts and fancy model airplanes, Scholz found one of his many callings in the form of mechanical tinkering. And by the time he graduated high school, it was with top honors and a hunger for something more. Despite his future career path, Scholz says he never actually had a particular interest in music during his childhood, though he did take piano lessons for several years at his parents' request. By the mid-60s, Tom Scholz uprooted his Rust Belt digs and headed north for the storied halls of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. Yep, that's right, our boy was a bona fide nerd, pencil pocket protector and all. Probably. More importantly though, it was during his time at MIT that Scholz says he finally caught the music bug. It was the 60s and the British rock invasion was in full swing. Scholz says he heard the chugging power chords of bands like the Yardbirds and the Kinks, and suddenly he wanted to be a rock star. While at school, he joined his first rock band and briefly played with a few locals. Buoyed by his years as a star student, Scholz entered the 70s with success, landing a career as a senior product designer for the Polaroid Corporation straight out of school. The Massachusetts transplant quickly made a name for himself as a tech genius. Although his work at Polaroid fulfilled the all-American dream of a stable job and a comfortable lifestyle, Tom Scholz was simply a dreamer. Rather than finding contentment in his high-earning position, he began to imagine an entirely different way of life. Because even though Scholz had already achieved much at a young age, there was so much more to accomplish. And when it came time to decide where next to turn his attention, Tom Scholz began looking back at his time in the band. Despite years of piano lessons, college bands, and a sturdy understanding of musical theory, Tom Scholz had never considered himself a musician. Perhaps inspired by the big rock acts that began dominating the airwaves, Scholz saw something he craved. The lights, the crowds, the adulation and respect. Not the kind of hopes and dreams you might expect from a young tech nerd with a lucrative career. But for Tom Scholz, the rock star life came calling. On top of his growing fascination with rock and pop superstars, Scholz also began to see a change in the industry, one that his education and upbringing had perfectly prepared him for. Complicated, gear-based industries, mechanical ingenuity and audio evolution, new developments in recording with streamlined machinery. Yes, the dawn of the studio musician was upon us in the 70s, and Tom Scholz wanted in on it. While working at Polaroid, Scholz joined a project designing a sound system for a portable home video player. And while working on that project, he learned all the fundamentals of audio recording. He started to become fascinated with the idea of recording sound on the tape, and so he'd scrape together some money and buy time at a local recording studio to noodle around and make a few demos. But the issue is that these were small, cheap studios designed for casual sessions, and they were simply incapable of producing the kinds of sounds that Scholz had trapped in his imagination. Sensing a shift in creative ownership and big budget production in the music industry, Scholz began an obsession with what would completely change the course of his life. And for the next 6 years, he did everything in his power to become that very different kind of person. Using his Polaroid paychecks to fund his new hustle, Tom Scholz started amassing a large amount of audio components, spending his nights poring over technical manuals and learning the fundamentals of audio engineering theory and sound theory, and building his own home recording studio in the basement of his apartment. Not building as in buying a bunch of equipment and connecting it together, building as in literally manufacturing his own recording gear built to his exact specifications, armed with nothing but a soldering iron, a bunch of technical manuals, and enough coffee to stave off Freddy Krueger for the next decade. Because between his full-time job at Polaroid and his all-night building and recording sessions, he just wasn't sleeping. Back in those days, home studios were highly abnormal, extremely complicated and cost prohibitive for just about everyone. The idea of recording music from your own house was the stuff of pipe dreams at the time, but saddled with his technological genius and a steady cash flow, Scholz was the earliest of exceptions. And by the time his recording space had taken shape, the pre-Boston bachelor turned his basement into a veritable rock and roll wonderland.
I would actually close my eyes and blank out that I was in the basement of an apartment house in Watertown. And I would literally imagine I was in front of thousands of people playing this rock and roll music, and it worked.
Even though he was a proficient enough piano player and one-time bandmate, Tom Scholz was not your typical musician. It would be easy to assume his limited knowledge of rock and roll instruments would exclude him from sitting in on sessions. But when it comes to Scholz, nothing is so simple. Not content to sit behind the control booth, Tom Scholz instead began to teach himself how to play, well, just about everything. From lead and rhythm guitar to bass and synthesizers, Scholz was committed to music as a science and an art. In just a few short years, the once stately Polaroid senior designer took on an entirely new persona. With the newly developed music skills and a wide variety of instruments and recording gear, Tom Scholz embarked on his new career in earnest. Starting with a series of demos, Scholz recorded several rock compositions on his own in the mid-70s. By rehashing song ideas and rekindling relationships with the old college buddies, Scholz truly developed as a musician, and in typical Tom fashion, he achieved these goals with enormous speed. In fact, by the time he began sending demos out to recording companies, he had completed work on many of the songs that would come to define Boston as a band. But before his big ideas got off the ground, those pesky A&R reps gave Scholz some serious headaches. Because home studios were so rare and session musicians rarely made successful stars, the record label just did not know how to react when they learned Scholz was essentially a solo act. Because despite calling up a college pal to play drums on his demos, Scholz's situation as a one-man band proved less than appealing to the average executive. And so, with several rejections already in tow, Scholz decided it was time to track down a leading man. Well, a lead singer at least, because even in those formative years, Boston was and still is the Tom Scholz Show. But at the time, the tech wizard and studio superstar needed a voice that could change the hearts and minds of major record labels. And when he finally turned to a singer named Brad Delp, those doors began to open. Although their first legitimate band, Mother's Milk, proved to be just as unsuccessful with demo pitches and manager meetings, Scholz and Delp had a major breakthrough. After dumping their garish band name for several misfiring monikers, Scholz composed 6 songs that broke the ice. With his home studio, a plethora of instruments, and 0 creative interruptions, Scholz recorded these tracks basically on his own, with Delp on vocals, a college buddy on drums, and Scholz playing literally everything else. These early tracks were about as fully formed as any record exec could hope for. In fact, by the time his band finally made it to the big leagues, these early demo tunes would stay basically intact. But before they got their break, Scholz realized that he had a major problem. Unsatisfied with an early performance played before a crowd of recording agents, Tom Scholz was forced to make an uncomfortable decision. Although his act was starting to be seen as something manageable by the bag holders, Scholz's first drummer just couldn't hack it. Opting for an embarrassing and outdated drum solo rather than the professional playing requested by his bandmates, the drummer was given the boot just moments before their big debut. After hiring a more dependable sit-in, the band's final demo was seen as a smashing success. And with a much more professional live showcase under their belt, Scholz was offered a 6-year, 10-album deal. Although that might sound outrageous for an untested band, the recording industry often operated under such lengthy terms as a way to bank off of their acts for decades. But even outside of industry standards, the demo from Scholz & Company is an absolute revelation. With his soaring guitars, impeccable timing, and polished production, Scholz created a product that was basically just impossible to deny. Layered with Brad Delp's majestic voice and Tom's keen eye for lyricism, you had one stunned group of A&R men. Take for example the group's first demo of More Than a Feeling, which, when heard in its infancy, tells you everything you need to know about what the band was capable of. So, at this point, Scholz was in a really weird position. The music he made was too good for the labels to pass up, but they also were perplexed by the idea that he had recorded these demos by himself in his basement and saw his bid to actually record the real album this way to be amateurish, childish, and just not the way things were done-ish. So Scholz was having every one of his wildest dreams dangled right in front of his face like so many cartoon pies with the little scent lines wafting into his nose. But unlike, say, Yogi Bear, he had the willpower to say no if the pie wasn't his favorite flavor. Is this metaphor working? Anyway, the label insisted that the album proper be recorded in an actual studio in LA, and Scholz, who'd been in the studios before and knew how disappointing their results were, demanded to record in his techno dungeon. He invited the band's newly hired producer, John Boylan, out to see his basement studio in a bid to convince him that the album could be done this way. But when Boylan saw the space, he immediately rejected any possibility that he would ever produce an album there. However, he must have seen something there that sold him on the vision, because he pitched Scholz on an idea. Possibly one of the zaniest, almost Scooby-Doo-like ideas in music industry history. What if they pulled the old switcheroo Skidamarink Skidoo 9000 on the label? Boylan would take Delp and the band's new drummer to LA, and they'd hang out in a fancy studio for a couple months, pretending like they were recording an album. Like literally sitting in the booth and singing fake songs into a microphone for hours in case any of the A&R guys stopped by to check on them. And while this decoy band was in LA going full Argo on their asses, Scholz would be holed up in his basement in Boston, actually recording the real thing. And when Scholz sent in his polished and pristine production to the West Coast, Delp and the drummer simply tracked their parts on top of the mostly complete album, and Boylan mastered it to tape. But even though the studio's producer had very little to do with the finished product, he did make one suggestion of great importance. Still without a proper name, Boylan thought perhaps the band should keep things simple. What about Boston? A solution so simple, it makes me wonder why we didn't think of it. Just name yourself after where you are right now. We toil away for months trying to think of a name for this YouTube channel when we could have just named ourselves Your Mom's Condo. And so, with an official name and a hot debut record, Boston's first self-titled album was released in 1976. That's less than 10 years from when Tom Scholz decided to make a go of it in music. Just 6 years since he began developing his home studio, which is even more impressive when you think about the fact that during that time, he was also just straight up learning how to play instruments and write music. That's like if you got interested in tennis tomorrow and then ended up competing in the next Olympics. But what is that saying? Those who burn bright burn out the fastest? Because even though his first album was a smash success, Scholz would go on to face incredible strife in his career as a musician that all amounted to extreme character flaws that nobody, even seemingly Scholz himself, saw coming. With heaps of hits and one of the most enigmatic album covers of all time, Boston hit it big in a flash. But due to Scholz's perfectionist predilections, the good times stopped rolling shortly after. Back in the 70s, a hit record meant more records to follow very soon. But because Scholz held back on new material in hopes of meeting his own high standards, Boston would not release a follow-up for more than 2 years. While that might sound like small potatoes to modern ears, it was completely unheard of at the time. Additionally, normally a band goes on several tours in between album cycles to keep up their momentum. But Scholz instead opted to hole up in his basement again and obsessively quibble over every tiny, insignificant detail of the band's follow-up album. And without the internet and social media, this was like if the man or woman of your dreams confessed their undying love for you and then immediately dropped off the face of the planet for 2 years. When Boston did finally release their second album, Tom Scholz was deeply unsatisfied. And even though they continued to sell tickets and LPs all over the world, Scholz's reputation as a tough teammate preceded him. Boston would face numerous lineup changes, extreme gaps between albums, and an insane amount of lawsuits that ultimately earned the band, and specifically Scholz himself, the reputation as one of the most difficult to work with musical acts in history. The trouble started all the way back in the late 70s. After their second album, Don't Look Back, which despite taking 2 years was about as big of a hit as their first album, was released in 1978, Scholz immediately returned to his home studio to start writing and recording new songs for a follow-up. However, a former manager for the band, Paul Ahern, appeared after the success of Don't Look Back to claim that, according to a prior written agreement he had with the band, they owed him part of the royalties for all of their album sales in perpetuity, so forever. Being the type of stubborn that Scholz was, he immediately put any plans of releasing new music as Boston on the back burner indefinitely, rather than give this ambulance chaser a single penny. The band went on a hiatus. At the time, Boston consisted of Scholz, Delp, Sib Haitian on drums, Fran Sheehan on bass, and Barry Goudreau on rhythm guitar. Scholz suggested that they all pursue other projects and release albums under different names until the royalty situation was worked out. However, after Goudreau entered the studio to record his own solo album, 1980's Barry Goudreau, recruiting Delp for vocals and Haitian for drums and hiring a recording engineer that had worked with Boston before and knew a lot of the band's recording techniques, Scholz was shocked to hear the finished result and discover that it sounded exactly like Boston. It turned out that Goudreau was about as imaginative with songwriting as he was with titling albums. What was even worse, the band's record label CBS started marketing the album by mentioning its connection to Boston and Scholz, implying that he was somehow involved with it despite not having written or played on the record at all. Scholz held a band meeting after the release of Barry Goudreau and fired Goudreau on the spot. In response to this, Brad Delp quit the band in solidarity, though he agreed to stay long enough to finish Boston's third album and tour. Boston's third album, Third Stage, was eventually released in 1986, a full 8 years after the previous album, largely due to a combination of Scholz's obsession with perfection, internal conflicts among the band members, and the legal dispute about royalties with Paul Ahern. But despite clearing up that legal situation, Scholz was eventually sued by CBS for breach of contract, citing that the band failed to turn in a finished album within a reasonable amount of time. And honestly, they kind of had a point. 8 years is a long time between a second and third album. The CBS lawsuit was eventually settled in Scholz's favor in 1990, but it seems the biggest lesson he took away from that experience was that he can win lawsuits. Because for the next several years, he filed several of his own, most of them being libel suits against national publications. Most notably, in 2010, after the tragic suicide of the band's former and current lead singer, Brad Delp, he quit the band after the release of the Third Stage in 1986, but rejoined in 1994 to sing on their fourth album, Walk On. The Boston Herald published an article featuring an interview with Delp's widow that painted Scholz in an unfavorable light. Scholz sued the newspaper and the widow for libel, claiming that the article unfairly implied that he was responsible for Delp's suicide. After a 5-year battle, Scholz lost that suit and was forced to pay the Herald $130,000 in legal fees. And yes, you heard that right. The band's fourth album was released in 1994, another 8 years after their third. Boston would continue that tradition all the way up until today, with their fifth album, Corporate America, releasing in 2002, and their sixth, Live, Love, and Hope, in 2013. The dude loves to tweak his EQs. And then there were the changes in band members. Have you ever seen one of those timeline graphs on Wikipedia that tracks all the different rotating members of a band and the times that they played? Boston's looks like the street that Frogger tried to cross. 22 members across 50 years, many of them leaving and returning in overlapping spurts, somehow featuring 2 different men named Fran, with Scholz being the only consistent member. Most of these issues stemmed entirely from Scholz's role as master and commander. From contract disagreements to personal attacks, Boston became a revolving door of musicians and record labels. In fact, by their mid-career flop, Boston had completely bankrupted a former record label under Tom Scholz's direction. He was burning bridges left and right, and all in all, it was looking like Boston was the goose that laid the golden egg. But then every egg after that was just kind of a regular egg. The kind that you could get from any regular grocery store and probably wouldn't have to put up with an extremely difficult to work with goose who was obsessed with hanging out in his basement. With his rock star career on the rocks and not shaping up the way he thought it would, Scholz fell back on the thing that made him stand out as a musician to begin with, making custom music gear. In 1980, he founded Scholz Research Development Inc., or SR&D, a boutique music and recording equipment company that specialized in creating extremely unique pieces that didn't really exist anywhere else in the market, many of which were based on the bespoke gear that Scholz had built for his home studio throughout the years. During the company's existence, they created many products that were custom designed by Scholz himself, including special preamps, MIDI controllers, and rack-mounted recording equipment. But most notably, the company released the Rockman line of headphone guitar amplifiers, one of the world's first amp simulator modules. It was a handheld device about the size of a Walkman portable cassette player, which incidentally it was named after, that you could plug a guitar into and then listen to yourself playing through a pair of headphones so that you didn't have to lug around a giant guitar amp or bother your neighbors while you played. And this little analog piece of gear was able to simulate the sound of a real guitar amp and also produce a couple of different effects such as distortion, echo, and chorus. The Rockman, or Rockman as it's technically actually called because of the Walkman association, took the world by storm and was a massive success with players. Not only was it a great way to practice quietly and portably while still getting a big sound, but also guitarists and producers eventually discovered that you could essentially use it in the studio, completely replacing the need to record guitars using loud amps rigged up with microphones. In fact, all the guitar parts on the album Hysteria by Def Leppard were recorded using a Rockman plugged directly into the mixing board. The Rockman was a precursor to, if not the direct inspiration for, the modern-day guitar amp sim plugin you can get in any basic recording software on your computer. But the technology that Scholz inspired also ended up being his company's downfall. In the late 80s, the advent of digital recording technology basically rendered all of the analog gear that SR&D was producing irrelevant. Scholz's entire thing was using his whiz-kid engineering skills to create small machines that were able to effectively mimic the sound and quality of much larger, much bulkier equipment. But digital technology did that times 1,000, moving all of those sounds created by the big bulky equipment onto ones and zeros on a computer where they took up essentially no space at all and could be called up with the click of a button. SR&D shuttered in the mid-90s, but Scholz worked out a deal with the Dunlop Music Company and they still sell a version of the Rockman and multiple variations of it to this day. But why does the name Rockman sound so familiar? Is it because that's the original Japanese name for the popular video game character Mega Man? No, that's not it, although, incidentally, Scholz's Rockman predates the Blue Bomber by 6 years. Oh, yeah, that's right. Rockman is the name of that song that crashed the internet for a couple of weeks by McGee. He performed it on SNL and everything. And do you want to know why the song is called Rockman? Well, because McGee recorded the guitars on the song using an SR&D Rockman headphone amplifier unit. Yeah, that's right. The internet's current favorite indie guitar sensation wouldn't exist without the musical contributions of Mr. Tom Scholz himself. Boston has continued releasing albums over the years, and Tom Scholz remains their guiding light. After Brad Delp's tragic death, Scholz hired a number of vocalists to take his place, but when he sued Delp's grieving widow in 2010, the band's reputation never quite recovered. The only thing left to reflect on now is what side of Tom Scholz's legacy has left a larger impact on the culture of music. His singular genius at marrying songwriting, creative vision, and technical ingenuity together to create a wholly unique sound, or his debilitating obsession with control and perfection and the wasted potential, unrealized music, and hurt it's caused. And thus concludes another case file from the archives of the Mystery Treehouse. If you like the way that we covered the story, give the video a like and subscribe to our channel. We have new videos every week. You might also want to check out our podcast, the Deep Cuts Podcast, which is available on all platforms and linked here. We do multi-hour deep dives on topics just like this. And until next time, stay curious, chums.